Good morning, you all. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with history for our Homeschool Friday lesson today from the Relic Room. My name's Joe Long. I'm the Curator of Education here. And before we get underway, just a couple of things. Be aware that we actually have another session coming up today. If you'd like to check back in at 11:30, you can catch my colleague, Miss Hillary Brannock is going to be, and I'm admitting her to the session right now. As I was saying, Miss Hillary Brannock will be giving a South Carolina Fights for Independence lesson at 11:30. Also, I've had some inquiries as to when Homeschool Fridays are going to start up for real in person again, rather than on Zoom. I don't have a good answer for you on that. I am hoping that with the new semester in 2021, that'll happen. So our popular dancing and dueling session, I don't think we can dance virtually in December, but maybe we'll work something out. We'll have some kind of a session. But thank you all for checking in, and it is time to kick off. And I know the right way to do that for this particular lesson. Fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you, in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. William Barrett Travis, Lieutenant Colonel, commanding. That's known these days as the Travis letter. There were other messages sent from Travis, but that is the one that goes down in time and makes the siege and battle at the Alamo, which lasted for 13 days, one of the best remembered stories of American military heroism. And that's the battle we're going to look at a little bit today. I hope that when it's done, that you, like so many Americans before you, will find it easy to remember the Alamo, that some of this story will indeed stick with you. I'm going to rely on a couple of different resources today. Some of you have been following as we've gone day by day through Theodore Roosevelt's American Hero Tales. I did a lesson on the Alamo out of Hero Tales a couple of weeks ago, a lesson that is now gone on to the museum's virtual learning website. If you want to catch up with American Hero Tale lessons, they eventually show up there. And I will be borrowing from Roosevelt's book again, as well as for the two of you that have seen that slideshow before, you're going to see some familiar images coming up, also some new ones. We have a little more time with the Alamo today, and today we're particularly going to add some details about South Carolinians at that particular battle. So let's see what I can do about getting our slideshow underway. And yes, I did use this title out of the American Hero Tales book because that's how Roosevelt kicks off his story of the Alamo with a quote: "Thermopylae had its messengers of death, but the Alamo had none." Well, one of the stories we will add today is literally about a messenger from the Alamo, but the quote still stands pretty well. If you were an educated person in the 1800s, you definitely would recognize a reference to Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a famous battle in ancient history. Some modern Americans may have seen the film 300, which is a romanticized version of what happened at Thermopylae. But what happened at Thermopylae, for real, 300 Spartan warriors under King Leonidas picked a spot where a huge invading Persian army had to go through a narrow pass. And there at that narrow pass, the 300 held back thousands for long enough for the rest of the Greek city-states to get their armies together and to have a chance to fight a battle against the invader. But at Thermopylae, all 300 defenders perished. And that's why the comparison was made to that fight in ancient history, because the Alamo is going to be a very similar situation. A fort in the way of a huge army and a small band of men who are determined to hold that huge army back as long as possible, even at the expense of their own lives. And the ancient battle at Thermopylae led to the victory at the plains of Marathon. Well, the battle at the Alamo would lead to the gathering Texas Army having a great victory at San Jacinto. So it's a very good history parallel. Now, let's set the scene a little bit and see how we got there. Oh, I thought I had imported a slide, which I actually had not. The men who will face each other down at this place, the men who will face each other down in this battle, are fighting over Texas independence. What is now the state of Texas was all Mexican territory in the 1800s. And the Texas Revolution occurred because when you moved to Texas as a settler from the United States, you crossed a national boundary. You went into Mexico. You had to become a Mexican citizen to settle there. You had to take a Mexican citizen's oath. You also, by the way, had to be baptized by a Roman Catholic priest. And Colonel Travis, who we're going to meet in a little bit, South Carolinian who moved in, he had no objections. He came in, became a Mexican citizen, was baptized as a Roman Catholic. These were compromises that he was perfectly willing to make, as the other Texan settlers were that came in. But they came into a nation, Mexico, that had a constitution, and they came in to get land and the opportunity to prosper there. And then Mexico's dictator, the man you see on the left there in a formal uniform, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. In 1835, this new Mexican dictator abolished the Constitution of Mexico, which was a bad sign. And then the American settlers, the Texians as they were called, who'd moved in, one thing Mexico valued about these men was they were tough fighting men. And they were in this part of Mexican territory where they were kind of a buffer in between the Mexican peasants who are farming and the hostile and sometimes predatory Indian tribes of that area, the Comanche and so forth. So their fighting qualities are welcomed, but Santa Anna, taking stock of the country that he's in charge of, sees them as a potential problem, which they certainly were, but he quickly made them from a potential problem into a real problem by giving orders, not only abolishing the Mexican Constitution, but giving orders that these Texans should disarm, that the Mexican army would be what would protect them from now on. And the Texans rose in revolt. You may have seen a symbol that still floats around today, is a picture of a cannon on a flag that says under it, "Come and take it." And this refers to a cannon that was owned by the Texan settlers at a town called Goliad. And when they would chant in later that year, "Remember the Alamo," they also chanted, "Remember Goliad," because at the town of Goliad, the Mexican army was sent to take away the cannon. And in the ensuing fight, they massacred the defenders and others who happened to be nearby at Goliad. By the way, when the Texans came up with this flag with a picture of a cannon and the words that said, "Come and take it," they were actually referencing that same ancient battle, Thermopylae. In Greek, "come and taken," or "come and take them," is molin labe. And that was the reply the Spartan king had given to the Persians all those many centuries before, when the Persians sent a message to the Spartans that said, "Lay down your weapons." The Spartans replied, "Molin labe," "come and take them." The Texans are showing the same kind of defiance. And that is what sets up the situation at the Alamo. Now, I'm going to leave my presentation here for a second. Pull out my HD camera. They've given me a new toy. A really neat review, and this is an unsolicited endorsement. Dover doesn't give the museum any kickback, I'm sorry to say. It'd be nice if they did. But the Dover company that produces these historic coloring books, they tend to be pretty inexpensive and quite good quality. And I'm going to rely on my coloring book here to give you a quick overview of what the Alamo complex looked like back in 1836. The Alamo was not designed as a fort. It was designed as a mission. It was a Roman Catholic mission. And it was no longer functioning as a mission by the time it was being used as a fort. And you can see that areas of it were, the chapel, for instance, had no roof on it anymore. You see there's an irrigation ditch here along the bottom, and walls around the complex as a whole. So it's within this fort, not designed as a fort, that Colonel Travis and his men are going to make their stand. All right, some leaders to remember from the Alamo. William Travis. Travis is a South Carolinian. He is the one who sent that defiant letter. We will return to him in a little bit. James Bowie is one of the famous frontiersmen who is going to perish at the Alamo. James Bowie, who is second in command. By some accounts, he's almost a sort of a co-commander. And James Bowie is famous as the inventor of the Bowie knife. And he's got a fascinating life story in his own right. He's a pretty rough character. The Bowie knife was actually designed as a dueling weapon, and some legends say the original one was made of iron from a meteorite. James Bowie will be present, but sick at the Alamo, so he spends a lot of his time there during the 13-day siege as kind of an invalid. Davy Crockett. Crockett is going to arrive at the Alamo in command of a small group of Tennessee riflemen who are very welcome indeed. And a fourth figure we're going to talk about because of his South Carolina connections and his heroism is James Butler Bonham. We'll deal with each of these men in turn. This is the Alamo cenotaph. A cenotaph is a tombstone, sort of, or a monument where the body is not present. So Travis and Crockett are featured prominently there among other defenders of the Alamo. The names are all listed there. And these approximately 180 defenders will hold back the Mexican army. William Travis, South Carolinian, came from Saluda County at one time, and they might still have some of them around. The Saluda County had bumper stickers that said Texas starts here because of their strong Texas connections. And in fact, a great place to see a neat miniature model of the Alamo and its siege is at the Saluda County History Museum. I think it's a 1/64th scale model, which is about the scale of Plastic Army men. And that's a great way to study the battle itself. But Travis he was a restless frontiersman, to say the least. He was actually a cousin of James Bonham. He had a law degree, and he had moved to Alabama and then moved on further out to Texas. There were troubles in Alabama after he moved out there. There are various stories about what happened out there. He may have killed a man in a duel, or it may not exactly have been a duel, but it was a personal dispute. And like many who went out to settle in Texas, he sort of went out under a cloud. But when he got there, his leadership qualities asserted themselves, and he was chosen for a responsible position. Now, his cousin, James Bonham, let's hop ahead to James Bonham here. His cousin, James Bonham, was another well-educated and well-spoken man, and somewhat of a difficult man. Bonham had not quite graduated from South Carolina College. He entered the college in 1823. During his senior year at the college, he led a student protest, and it was a protest about bad food there. Another point that the students had that they wanted to make, they didn't want to be required to attend class in bad weather. Bonham was expelled for his part as a ringleader in the student troubles at USC, and he took up the study of law and started practicing in Pendleton. Law was a pretty rough profession in the 1830s, and one of the things Bonham was known for was caning. He took a walking stick to an opposing lawyer because the man insulted his client. The judge ordered Bonham to apologize, which seems reasonable. He'd hit the man with a stick. But Bonham believed, since the man had insulted a lady, and a lady who happened to be his client, that he deserved to be hit with a stick. And when told to apologize, Bonham threatened to tweak the judge's nose as well. And he wound up serving 90 days for contempt of court. That didn't stop him from rising in politics. He was an aide to the governor during the nullification crisis. And eventually, he served as captain of an artillery company in Charleston. Useful experience once he was at the Alamo. And eventually went west to Texas and organized a volunteer company to do that. He became friends with Sam Houston and wound up inside the Alamo. Now, the most famous thing about him at the Alamo, when Roosevelt quoted that Thermopylae had its messengers of death, a few people who got away by carrying messages of what had happened, and so survived the battle. But the Alamo had none. Well, James Bonham was that messenger, was the man sent to carry word of the situation out through the Mexican lines to his friend Sam Houston, in charge of the Texan army. And so he carried the message out, a very dangerous expedition, by himself, pursued by Mexican lancers, using both stealth and bold speed to get through the Mexican lines. And then he did it again. James Butler Bonham used all of his skill and cunning and the muscles of his horse to again ride through the dangerous Mexican lines and return to the Alamo. He returned to the doomed fort. And for that reason, he is remembered in a special place as one of the heroes of the Alamo, because Thermopylae had its messengers of death who survived. The Alamo had one, and yet didn't have one, because Bonham didn't take advantage of the safety he'd gained to remain alive. Instead, Bonham returned into the doomed fort. Crockett and Bowie, both legendary figures of the West. Davy Crockett, known, well, let's use Roosevelt's wonderful description of Davy Crockett. Born soon after the Revolution, he had taken part under Jackson in the campaigns against the Creeks, and had afterwards become a man of mark in Tennessee, and had gone to Congress as a Whig. But he'd quarreled with Jackson and been beaten for Congress, and in his disgust, he left the state and decided to join the Texans. He was the most famous rifle shot in all the United States and a most successful hunter, so that his skill was a proverb all along the border. David Crockett journeyed south by boat and horse, making his way steadily toward the distant plains where the Texans were waging their life and death fight. Near the town was an old Spanish fort, the Alamo, in which 150 American defenders of the place had gathered. Santa Anna had 4,000 troops with him. The Alamo was a mere shell, unable to withstand either bombardment or a regular assault. Old Crockett and his companion never wavered. They were fearless and resolute and masters of woodcraft, and they managed to slip through the Mexican lines and join the defenders within the walls. The bravest, the hardiest, the most reckless men of the border were there. Among them were Colonel Travis, the commander of the fort, and Bowie, the inventor of the famous Bowie knife. They were a wild and ill-disciplined band, little used to restraint or control, but they were men of iron courage and great bodily powers, skilled in the use of their weapons and ready to meet with stern and uncomplaining indifference whatever doom fate might have in store for them. Among the stories that Roosevelt relates is Davy Crockett eliminating one of the cannon crews that the long frontier rifles, the Kentucky rifles, employed by the best American marksmen, had a longer range than some of the Mexican smoothbore cannons. And so the cannon would be useless because the crewmen would be shot down by accurate rifle fire. So the siege and bombardment went on and would conclude with a rush. And again, I'm going to borrow the phrases from the Roosevelt book because they are so good. When they pushed nearer, the American riflemen crept forward under cover and picked off the artillerymen. Old Crockett thus killed 5 men at one gun. But by degrees, the bombardment told. The walls of the Alamo were battered and riddled, and when they had been breached, so as to afford no obstacle to the rush of his soldiers, Santa Anna commanded that they be stormed. The storm took place on March 6th, 1836. The Mexican troops came on well and steadily, breaking through the outer defenses at every point. The lines were too long to be manned by the few Americans. The frontiersmen then retreated to the inner building, and a desperate hand-to-hand fight followed, the Mexicans thronging it, shooting the Americans with their muskets and thrusting at them with lance and bayonet, while the Americans, after firing their long rifles, clubbed them and fought desperately, one against many, and they also used their Bowie knives and revolvers with deadly effect. The fight reeled to and fro between the shattered walls, each American the center of a group of foes, but for all their strength and their wild fighting courage, the defenders were too few, and the struggle could have but one end. One by one, the tall riflemen succumbed after repeated thrusts with bayonet and lance, until but 3 or 4 were left. Colonel Travis, the commander, was among them, and so was Bowie, sick and weak from a wasting disease, but who rallied all his strength to die fighting. The last man stood at bay. It was old David Crockett, wounded in a dozen places. He faced his foes with his back to the wall, ringed about by the bodies of the men he had slain. So desperate was the fight he waged, the Mexicans who thronged round him were beaten back for the moment. No one dared to run in upon him. Accordingly, while the lancers held him where he was, the musketeers loaded their carbines and shot him down. Santa Anna declined to give him mercy. Well, that's a very thorough description with a lot of detail, and then Roosevelt and Lodge admit immediately that they're not sure that's an accurate one, because some say that when Crockett fell from his wounds, he was taken alive and then shot by Santa Anna's order. And that is something that actually appears in a Mexican officer's journal. But his fate cannot be told with certainty, for not a single American was left alive. At any rate, after Crockett fell, the fight was over. Well, these heroes of the Alamo had bought the time that was necessary, and some of the decisions that the enemy commander, Santa Anna, made along the way ensured the aftermath. Santa Anna probably was making a terrible mistake to take the time to besiege the Alamo in the first place, rather than moving forward and trying to engage the main army facing him. But he gave orders early on saying that, actually running up here a flag, let's take a look at this good old coloring book again. The red banner raised above the bell tower, and you see the death's head on the banner of the San Fernando Church. The banner said, "No surrender, no quarter." Now, he's trying to intimidate them into surrender without a fight when Santa Anna says, "Unless you surrender right now, we won't be taking prisoners." But something that does in battle is then once the battle has started, the other guy's going to fight very, very hard because he has absolutely nothing to lose. You've already promised that he's not allowed to surrender. And not only did that make the battle longer and harder, it enraged those Texans who were gathering to strike back at Santa Anna. And that is why at the battle at San Jacinto, where they took the Mexican army by surprise, the battle cry was, "Remember the Alamo." And they remembered the Alamo with a terrible vengeance on the Mexican army that they destroyed that day, capturing, by the way, Santa Anna himself. So there's a couple of lessons in there. And I would like also to mention, as the simplification of the history refers to this being the Texans against the Mexicans. Let's not leave out those Mexicans who were fighting against the dictator, Santa Anna, the Tejanos. The Tejanos are Mexican by nationality and birth and part of the side of Travis and Crockett. And they too become among the American heroes of this fight. So just a little word about aftermath, and then I'll open the floor for questions. My goodness, I'm doing a better job staying on schedule than with my supposedly shorter sessions. A little note about the aftermath. So James Butler Bonham is killed at the Alamo. The man that you see in the photograph here is his brother, Millage Luke Bonham. And that's important because while the Texans win their independence in their revolt in 1836, and Texas for a brief time actually becomes an independent nation, the Republic of Texas. They want to join the United States as a new state, but at that time, there's a lot of argument over the admission of new states because of the balance between the northern and southern states and so forth. So they wind up spending some time as an independent republic before a compromise can be struck. Meanwhile, Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, went home. And he did not lose his authority. He did not lose his office as technically the president, but actually the dictator of Mexico. He was an eccentric man, to say the least. When Santa Anna lost his leg, he had that leg preserved. And if there was some state event that the president couldn't be at personally, he would send his leg in a decorated box to represent his presence at the event. So if two parades on one day, perhaps the real president would be in one parade, the president's leg would be carried in a box in another parade. He was a man of tremendous ego, to say the least, and he was remembered throughout the United States mostly as a villain who had massacred the defenders of Goliad and had massacred the defenders of the Alamo. As a villain, and also as a deceptive, duplicitous, lying man, and one who had been very embarrassingly captured at San Jacinto, not wearing his own general's uniform, but disguised as a peasant, trying to get away. So that's going to be an important connection when the United States goes to war against Mexico again for the Mexican-American War. That's a war that's not always very well understood. The Mexican-American War is the one in which the United States takes a huge chunk of Mexican territory, stretching all the way out really to the Pacific. Several American states are entirely from territory that used to belong to Mexico, but was taken at the end of the Mexican War by the treaty that ended that war. And a question that we often get here at the Relic Room when people look at the banner of the Palmetto Regiment that fought in the Mexican War was why were South Carolinians and Americans in general, but of course especially South Carolinians, so eager to go fight in a war that a lot of historians look back on now and say, well, that war was kind of a land grab, and Americans don't fight wars of conquest to go take territory from somebody else, but there was a border incident there, and we swept over the border and then took huge amount of Mexican territory. Well, part of the answer is who they're fighting against. Here we have Millage Luke Bonham. What better military opportunity for him to fight in a way that is, to him, very justified than to go fight the dictator who had his brother killed at the Alamo. So not just for Millage Luke Bonham, who's actually in the U.S. Army, but also for the South Carolinians of the Palmetto Regiment. Part of what motivated them more than 10 years later was the knowledge of 13 South Carolina men, including Travis and Bonham, who had been killed at the Alamo, and the awareness that this was the same enemy, the same one from 1836. So that's one of those lessons of history too. If you want to understand why people are doing something, you need to look at their whole lives, not just the current events that are right in front of them, but the things that have formed their lives and their experiences. Okay, I've hopped around a little bit, as I tend to do. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording in a couple of minutes here and open the floor for questions that I might be able to answer. Again, I recommend for further study of the Alamo, there are a lot of terrific books out there. This is a much studied event. The state of Texas has taken a lot of trouble to preserve the site itself and the history of the site. The Saluda County History Museum has that wonderful miniature Alamo that's much recommended, a lot of information about the Alamo. The short essay, The Alamo, out of Hero Tales by Theodore Roosevelt, you can find that for free online. It's the story well told, maybe not in tremendous detail, and he has some details that are a little bit off, but it's not a bad starting point. And again, free plug for Dover and the story of the Alamo. That's not a bad place for young people to review this story either. So with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording and open the floor for questions. So thank you all.